This video is about Joshua Whitehead's novel Jonny Appleseed, which came out in 2018. The year before, he had published a book of poetry called Full Metal Indigiqueer, which explores some of the same themes, albeit through different characters, different narrative structures. After all, it was a book of poetry. So this is a novel. It's not uncommon to see a lot of writers, beginning with poetry, moving into novels. I don't know why that is. It's just something that frequently happens with a lot of writers. So this novel is interesting in the way that it approaches Canadian literature. It's doing some very conventional things and some very unconventional things. So, it opens with a very explicit discussion of sex, sexuality, which may be shocking to some readers. This is not, Canadian literature. So you'll notice that the few books that we're reading in the latter part of this course, Thomas King, Joshua Whitehead, and Larissa Lai, they're all very, very recent texts. And to some extent, they are challenging or asking us to consider conventions of Canadian literature. That what is this thing that we're studying in this course, Canadian literature? That many people, as I mentioned at the beginning of this course, might think of Canadian literature as what it's doing outside right now, snowing and, north and Eskimos as the non-politically correct term and everything. This is a history that a lot of people are writing out of. Now, this novel, starts out with something very different. It's some might call it pornographic in its detailing of what he's doing. And so this is, an interesting shift. It's certainly not unique, but to begin a novel in this way is certainly, challenging conventions of literary propriety. And this speaks to this kind of larger project, perhaps, that Whitehead is undertaking here, that he is challenging conventions not only of the literary realm, but also the realm of politics and race and culture. Okay, this is he's writing this Indian experience, what it means to be a person in Canada now. Okay, it's a very contemporary examination of identity. What does it mean to be a visible person of color, Indigenous person in Canada? What is that experience like? And it's a very raw, if I can use that term, take on that experience. Now, this has a literary tradition. There's some famous precedents to this. So, for example, we could run this back to the tradition of someone like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who writes a book called The Confessions in the late 18th, early 19th century, where he writes essays about sort of internal things that we think about but are not appropriate. And so it was a kind of exposure of the internal world of the self, my innermost thoughts and feelings. What are the things, appropriate or not, that I think about? And what Rousseau was getting us to consider was this interior world. What's that like? Okay, and so Whitehead is doing something similar here, although much later in a totally different context, to say, this is, how this character thinks and feels, and it's an exposure of that. So if you find this opening, somewhat shocking in its subject matter, we just have to look at, say, the residential school system and its history, to say, all right, well, these, other kinds of sexual acts and sexual abuses, physical abuses happened in residential schools, and we're offended by someone talking about, pleasuring the self. So, why do we find that offensive? And when we sort of gloss over or otherwise bury, the residential school history, that we should own up to these kinds of double standards or incongruities in the narratives that we discuss. So I'll just kind of, work through the opening chapter of this and highlight a few things that he's doing. Okay, so in this novel, there's a very clear focus on the body. A lot of what he does involves the body, not just acts of sex, but also the sense of inhabiting this body. What is it like to be this person of color, this Indigenous person? So he begins, I figured out that I was gay when I was 8. I like to stay up late after everyone went to bed. So notice that this is time when he can be alone, have some self-discovery, think about who he is. But he does this, interestingly, in a way that's mediated through popular culture. He's watching Queer as Folk. And so on the one hand, he's alone. On the other hand, he's accompanied by popular culture. On the one hand, he's exploring what it means to be gay. On the other hand, he's being told what it means to be gay by Queer as Folk. On the one hand, he's indigenous. On the other hand, Queer as Folk, I never watched the show myself, is probably largely, a white cast, in Pittsburgh, as he says. I don't know if there were African Americans in the show or not. But you get the point, right? It's clearly not a show about gay Indians, right? Like, he's not, seeing that. So you can see that on the one hand, there's the authentic, indigenous side of him and his queerness and so forth. But then that's being informed, influenced, not defined, but certainly influenced by these popular culture references. And, we should be aware of that throughout the text. This is a character who straddles both worlds of, a history of life of living on the reservation to a history and experience of living in the city. Okay? And so he trades in some of the stereotypes, right? At the time, my mom and I were living with my kokum because my dad had left us, a stereotype of the broken indigenous family. And we've read about, the residential school and the forced adoptions and all this. This is fairly standard fare. But, this wasn't forced adoption. It was some other social condition. He just left, as we'll see in a moment, for whatever reason. Okay. And so he says, I loved Queer as Folk. I wanted to be one of those gay men living their fabulous lives in Pittsburgh. So this desire, either to embody this idea of queerness or to get off the reservation. So this idea to become a gay person who's out and living, versus, someone who wants to get off the reservation, and so there's all these competing desires around who Jonny wants to be in the novel. He says, when I got a little older, I think I was 15, I remember watching Dan Savage and Terry Miller on the internet telling me that it gets better. You may or may not be familiar with this. This was a kind of famous or widely publicized gay rights activist sort of message that many of the major networks were promoting, that certain celebrities, either out or just coming out, would go on TV or other media and say, it gets better, that you might feel alone and closeted as a closeted homosexual, but if you come out, it does get better, that there is a community there to support you. But of course, as Jonny says in the novel, they told me that they knew what I was going through, that they knew me. How so? I thought. You don't know me. Okay? So, some of these actors and celebrities were like, white males who happen to be gay. And so they have privilege of being white and male on their side. And then they come out and say, it gets better. But he's like, yeah, you don't know what it's like to be me. He says, you don't know what it's like being a brown gay boy on the res. So, this is a term that you should be familiar with. Perhaps you've heard it before. If not, here it is. It's called intersectionality. And it's this idea of in what ways does our identity interact or intersect with other marked areas. So, for example, you can identify as a specific sex, male or female, okay? You can perform gender identities. You can have sexual orientation, LGBTQ plus, whatever the case may be, right? You can be racialized and so forth. And so here he is. He's saying, okay, you're on TV saying it gets better, that you understand me, but actually I'm in a different kind of position. I'm gay, yes, I'm a guy, but I'm also an Indian on the res, okay? So how does that change things, okay? So that's not to say that the celebrities are wrong or they won't understand or can't understand. It's just to say that there's more factors at play than we perhaps initially realize. And he talks about, as he says, I conducted my business. And he talks about, gaining clients. And here's where the body enters it again, where desire and sexuality enters it again. And we see that he is using his body and his desire and his appeal, both exotic and homoerotic, to business ends. That is, he is capitalizing on this. And so this idea of identity politics, of identifying with particular areas of culture, can be commodified and exchanged in the capitalist system. And we can talk about, think about ways in which individuals want to have authentic experiences, but at the same time he seems forced into a position through poverty and marginalization to have to exploit his body and his identity in order to make money. And this is where he's degraded as an individual.